This is Henry Scott, broadcasting from emergency station Alpha 7, somewhere deep in the Carpathian Mountains of Romania. If you're hearing this transmission, you're still among the living, and that's more than I can say for most of Eastern Europe right now. The date is October 15th, 2024, and I've been holed up in this concrete bunker for 6 days straight. The diesel generator's running on fumes, my water's getting low, and the emergency rations taste like cardboard mixed with despair. But I need to tell you what I've learned, what I've witnessed. Because if someone doesn't document this nightmare, if someone doesn't warn whatever survivors are still out there listening, then we're all truly damned. My name is Henry Scott, and until 3 weeks ago, I was just another voice on late night radio, spinning tales of mystery and the unexplained for insomniacs and night shift workers across Europe. I had a comfortable life in Budapest, a small apartment overlooking the Danube, and the luxury of treating horror as entertainment. Those days feel like they belong to someone else now, someone naive enough to believe that the real monsters lived only in stories and folklore. I was wrong about so many things, but mostly I was wrong about thinking I understood what fear meant. It all started 21 days ago in a place most of you have never heard of, a forgotten village called Balteni in the remote Carpathian region of Romania. This isn't some tourist destination with quaint bed and breakfasts and scenic mountain views. Balteni is the kind of place where the mist clings to ancient stones like fingers of the dead, where the locals still cross themselves when they pass certain ruins, and where old women whisper warnings in languages that predate Christianity. The government archaeological team should have listened to those warnings. They should have paid attention to the fear etched into those weathered faces and the way grown men refused to go near the monastery ruins after sunset. The expedition was led by Dr. Marcus Drayson, a man whose academic arrogance was matched only by his complete dismissal of local superstition. His team had been contracted by the Romanian Ministry of Culture to conduct a preliminary survey of the 12th century monastery ruins that had been recently uncovered by a landslide. What they found buried beneath the collapsed chapel was a sealed stone crypt, approximately 8 feet long and 4 feet wide, carved from a single block of limestone and bound with iron bands that had somehow resisted 8 centuries of rust and decay. The local villagers begged them not to open it, speaking of ancient curses and things that should remain buried, but Drayson saw only an opportunity for career advancement and historical significance. Inside that crypt, they discovered something that should have been impossible: a mummified corpse, perfectly preserved despite the passage of centuries, pierced through with dozens of iron rods driven through the torso, limbs, and skull. The body was wrapped in decayed religious scriptures written in a mixture of Latin and what appeared to be some form of ancient Romanian dialect, and the entire crypt was lined with thick layers of rock salt that had somehow remained dry and intact. The preservation was so complete that you could still make out the expression of absolute terror frozen on the corpse's face, mouth open in what must have been a final scream that echoed through eternity. Dr. Drayson's initial field notes, which I've since obtained through channels I'd rather not discuss, describe the find as unprecedented in terms of preservation and ritualistic burial practices. He noted that the iron rods appeared to have been driven through the body while the victim was still alive, based on the bone fracture patterns and the way the tissue had healed around the metal. The scriptures wrapped around the corpse included passages from the Book of Revelation, but also contained texts that didn't match any known religious documents from the period. Most disturbing were the detailed anatomical drawings found beneath the body, showing what appeared to be some form of parasitic organism living within human blood vessels. Against the increasingly desperate pleas of the local population, Drayson ordered the corpse extracted and transported to Facility 7, a high-security government research installation located approximately 90 miles south of Balteny. The facility specialized in archaeological analysis and preservation, with state-of-the-art equipment for carbon dating, DNA analysis, and pathological examination. It was also where my mother, Dr. Elena Scott, worked as the head of the Biological Preservation Department. I hadn't spoken to her in over 2 years, not since our last argument about my choice to abandon my medical studies for a career in radio broadcasting, but her name was all over the transport authorization documents. The corpse arrived at Facility 7 on September 28th, and for the first few days, everything proceeded according to standard archaeological protocol. Initial carbon dating placed the remains at approximately 850 years old, dating back to the height of the medieval period when the monastery was still an active religious site. The iron rods were carefully documented and removed under sterile conditions, revealing puncture wounds that had somehow healed around the metal, suggesting the victim had survived the initial impalement for some time. The most unsettling discovery came when they began analyzing tissue samples under high-powered microscopes and found evidence of some form of parasitic organism still present in the bone marrow and blood vessels. Dr. Elena Scott's preliminary report, dated October 1st, described finding microscopic worm-like organisms in a state of apparent dormancy within the host tissue. Her notes indicated that exposure to modern laboratory conditions, specifically controlled temperature and humidity levels, seemed to be triggering some form of biological activity in these organisms. She recommended immediate containment protocols and suggested consulting with parasitology experts, but her warnings were overruled by the facility director, who was more concerned with completing the analysis ahead of schedule to secure additional government funding. That's when everything started going wrong. On October 2nd, a laboratory technician named Jacob Nemeth suffered a minor cut while handling bone samples from the corpse. It was the kind of small accident that happens in labs every day, barely worth noting in the incident report. Jacob cleaned the wound, applied antiseptic, and continued working. By the end of his shift, he complained of feeling dizzy and nauseous, symptoms everyone attributed to working too many double shifts and not getting enough sleep. He went home to his small apartment in the nearby town of Brazov, took some over-the-counter medication, and tried to rest. My mother's personal notes from October 3rd describe a frantic phone call from Jacob's girlfriend, reporting that he had developed a high fever and was experiencing severe photosensitivity, to the point where even dim indoor lighting caused him excruciating pain. When the facility's medical team arrived at his apartment, they found Jacob in a state of advanced delirium, speaking incoherently about being hungry for something he couldn't name, and displaying unusual aggression when anyone tried to approach him. His skin had taken on a grayish pallor, his pupils were severely dilated, and his body temperature had dropped to 94 degrees Fahrenheit, despite the fever symptoms reported earlier. They brought Jacob back to the facility for observation and treatment, isolating him in the medical wing while they ran tests to determine what kind of infection or toxin might be affecting him. The blood work showed massive changes in his cellular structure, with his red blood cell count dropping dramatically, while some form of unknown microorganism multiplied rapidly throughout his circulatory system. My mother's notes from that night are almost illegible, written in desperate haste as she tried to understand what was happening to Jacob and how it might relate to the parasites they'd found in the ancient corpse. Jacob Nemeth died on October 3rd at 11:23 p.m., according to the official facility records. Cause of death was listed as acute systemic failure brought on by an unknown parasitic infection. His body was transferred to the facility morgue while arrangements were made to transport him to a specialized pathology lab in Bucharest for further analysis. The medical team was confident they had contained whatever had killed him, and there was even talk of publishing papers about the discovery of a new species of parasitic organism. They had no idea that Jacob's death was not an ending, but a beginning. The motion sensors in the facility morgue triggered at 11:47 p.m., 24 minutes after Jacob had been officially pronounced dead. Security footage shows the morgue door opening from the inside, though no personnel were scheduled to be in that area during the night shift. When the morning staff arrived, they found Jacob's body missing from its refrigerated storage unit and evidence of what appeared to be a violent struggle in the corridor outside the morgue. There was blood on the walls, scratches in the metal paneling that looked like they'd been made by human fingernails, and a trail of dark stains leading toward the main laboratory complex. That was 6 days ago, and it was the last normal day any of us would ever experience. Within hours of Jacob's disappearance, staff members throughout the facility began reporting attacks by someone or something that moved through the corridors with inhuman speed and seemed to possess supernatural strength. The security cameras captured glimpses of a pale figure that might once have been Jacob Nemeth, but was now something else entirely. Something that hunted through the facility's corridors with predatory purpose, seeking out victims with a hunger that couldn't be satisfied. The last transmission from Facility 7 came through at 3:47 a.m. on October 4th. It was my mother's voice, barely audible over the sound of emergency alarms and what might have been screaming in the background. Her words were broken, distorted by terror and something else I couldn't identify at the time. She said, "Henry, if you're listening to this, they're not dead. They're changing. The Bartholomew Protocol, it's real. Find the..." And then nothing but static and sounds I still hear in my nightmares when I try to sleep. I drove through the night to reach the facility, covering the 400 miles from Budapest in less than 6 hours, but I was too late. By the time I arrived, the entire complex was surrounded by military vehicles and personnel in hazmat suits. They wouldn't let me get within 2 miles of the building, citing concerns about biological contamination and national security. A colonel whose name I never learned told me that there had been an industrial accident, a chemical leak that had resulted in multiple casualties, and that the facility would remain under quarantine indefinitely. When I pressed for information about my mother and the other staff members, he simply repeated the same scripted response about ongoing investigation and classified materials. But I could see the truth in the distance, beyond the military perimeter and the official lies. Facility 7 was gone, not destroyed by explosives or fire, but somehow consumed from within. The building stood intact, but every window was dark, every entrance sealed with concrete and steel barriers that looked hastily constructed. Whatever had happened inside those walls, whatever had been unleashed from that ancient crypt, the government's response was not containment, but burial. They were trying to bury the entire facility, along with everyone and everything inside it, beneath tons of concrete and steel and official silence. That night, I broke into my old childhood home and retrieved something my mother had hidden years ago, before our relationship fell apart. A shortwave radio setup she'd installed in the basement, powerful enough to reach across continents and designed to operate independently of any government or commercial infrastructure. She taught me how to use it when I was 12 years old, back when she still believed in preparing for disasters that might never come. I never imagined I'd need those skills to document the end of the world as we knew it. This is Henry Scott, broadcasting from Emergency Station Alpha 7, deep in the Carpathian Mountains. The date is October 19th, 2024, and I'm now on day 10 of isolation in this concrete tomb that's become my world. The diesel generator coughed twice during the night, and I've had to ration the fuel to make it last another week. The emergency radio equipment is holding steady, though I've been picking up fewer and fewer transmissions from the outside world. Either the stations are going dark, or there's nobody left to operate them. I'm hoping it's the former, but my gut tells me otherwise. I've spent the last 4 days going through the classified documents I managed to acquire before the military cordoned off everything within a 50-mile radius of Facility 7. These aren't official reports or sanitized government summaries, but the raw field notes, personal journals, and security footage transcripts that tell the real story of what happened in those final days. What I've discovered about Jacob Nimeth, about the thing that came out of that ancient crypt, and about the nature of the infection itself, has kept me awake for the past 72 hours straight. Sleep brings nightmares, and nightmares bring the faces of people who are no longer entirely human. Jacob Nimeth was 28 years old, a laboratory technician with 6 years of experience in archaeological specimen handling. He lived alone in a small apartment in Brasov, drove a 10-year-old Honda Civic, and had a girlfriend named Maria who worked at the local hospital as a nurse. By all accounts, he was ordinary, unremarkable, the kind of person you'd pass on the street without a second glance. His personnel file shows no history of mental illness, no record of violent behavior, no indication that he was anything other than a competent, reliable employee who showed up on time and did his job without complaint. That normalcy makes what happened to him even more terrifying, because it means it could happen to anyone. The cut on Jacob's hand occurred at 2:37 p.m. on October 2nd, while he was removing bone samples from the preserved corpse for microscopic analysis. According to the incident report filed by his supervisor, Dr. Amanda Walsh, Jacob was using a standard surgical scalpel to scrape marrow from the femur when the blade slipped and opened a shallow laceration across his left palm. The wound was approximately 2 inches long and deep enough to draw blood, but not severe enough to require stitches. Jacob immediately followed standard contamination protocols, flushing the wound with sterile saline solution and applying antiseptic before bandaging the cut with medical tape. What the official incident report doesn't mention, but what I found in Dr. Walsh's personal notes, is that Jacob's blood mixed with tissue samples from the corpse during the accident. When he reached for a towel to clean the wound, several drops of his blood fell directly onto the bone marrow specimen he'd been extracting. Dr. Walsh noted that the ancient tissue seemed to absorb Jacob's blood almost instantly, as if it were some kind of biological sponge that had been waiting centuries for fresh nutrients. She found this observation interesting enough to collect a sample of the mixed blood and tissue for later analysis, but not alarming enough to warrant immediate medical attention for Jacob. The microscopic analysis of that blood sample, conducted 18 hours later, revealed something that should have triggered immediate quarantine procedures. Dr. Walsh's laboratory notes described finding highly active microscopic organisms that appeared to be using Jacob's blood cells as a host environment. These organisms, which she described as resembling parasitic worms but much smaller than any known species, were not only alive but actively reproducing within the blood sample. More disturbing, they seemed to be altering the cellular structure of Jacob's blood, changing the chemical composition in ways that Dr. Walsh couldn't explain with her background in archaeology and preservation techniques. By the time these results were available, Jacob had already gone home for the evening, complaining of fatigue and a mild headache that he attributed to working under the intense laboratory lighting. His girlfriend Maria later told investigators that Jacob seemed normal when he arrived at their apartment around 6 p.m., though she noted that he appeared unusually pale and kept the curtains drawn because he said the evening sunlight was bothering his eyes. They had dinner together, watched television, and went to bed around 10 p.m. Maria fell asleep immediately, but Jacob tossed and turned throughout the night, occasionally muttering in his sleep about being hungry and cold. The real changes became apparent the following morning. Maria's statement to facility security describes waking up to find Jacob standing at the bedroom window, pressing his face against the glass and staring out at the dawn sky with what she described as absolute terror. When she tried to touch him, he recoiled as if her hand were burning hot, and she noticed that his skin felt cold and clammy despite the warm October weather. His pupils were dilated to the point where his eyes appeared almost completely black, and when he tried to speak, his voice came out as a hoarse whisper that didn't sound like him at all. Jacob called in sick to work that morning, the first time he'd used a sick day in over 2 years. When Dr. Walsh tried to reach him by phone around noon to discuss the unusual blood test results, Jacob's responses were confused and disjointed. He seemed unable to concentrate on her questions, repeatedly asking what time it was and complaining about being incredibly thirsty despite having consumed nearly 2 gallons of water since waking up. Most concerning was his insistence that he needed to return to the facility immediately, not to resume work, but because he said something there was calling to him, and he couldn't ignore it much longer. That afternoon, Maria contacted the facility's medical department after Jacob's condition deteriorated rapidly. She reported that he had developed a high fever, reaching 104 degrees Fahrenheit, but his skin remained cold to the touch. He was experiencing severe photosensitivity, to the point where even the dim light from their television caused him to cry out in pain and seek shelter in the apartment's darkest corners. Most alarming was his behavior when she tried to prepare food for him, displaying an almost violent revulsion to anything solid and repeatedly asking for something red that he couldn't identify or explain. Dr. Rebecca Martinez, the facility's chief medical officer, arrived at Jacob's apartment at 4:15 p.m. with a full medical team and portable diagnostic equipment. Her preliminary examination revealed physiological changes that defied medical explanation. Jacob's body temperature had dropped to 91 degrees Fahrenheit despite the earlier fever. His heart rate had slowed to 38 beats per minute, and his blood pressure had fallen to levels that should have resulted in unconsciousness or death. Most disturbing was the change in his blood chemistry, which showed a dramatic decrease in red blood cell count and the presence of unknown microorganisms that appeared to be replacing normal cellular functions. The decision was made to transport Jacob back to Facility 7 for intensive medical care and observation. During the ambulance ride, which took approximately 45 minutes, Jacob's condition continued to deteriorate in ways that the medical team had never encountered. His breathing became increasingly shallow and irregular. His skin took on a grayish pallor that made him look like he'd been dead for hours, and he began speaking in a language that none of the medical staff could identify. The words sounded vaguely Latin, but with pronunciation and inflection that suggested something much older and more primitive. Upon arrival at the facility, Jacob was immediately isolated in the medical wing's containment unit, a specialized room designed for handling potentially infectious patients. The room was equipped with negative air pressure, filtered ventilation, and reinforced security measures that could contain even the most dangerous biological hazards. Dr. Martinez and her team worked throughout the night, running every test available and consulting with infectious disease specialists from Bucharest and Vienna, but nothing in their medical training had prepared them for what they were observing. The blood work revealed that the parasitic organisms first detected in Jacob's laboratory accident sample had multiplied exponentially throughout his circulatory system. These creatures, which Dr. Martinez described as unlike anything in known parasitology, appeared to be systematically replacing Jacob's normal blood cells while somehow maintaining basic biological functions. More disturbing was evidence that the organisms were affecting his nervous system, particularly the areas of the brain responsible for aggression, hunger, and sensory processing. Brain scans showed unusual activity in the hypothalamus and brain stem, regions associated with predatory behavior in lower animals. By the evening of October 3rd, Jacob had stopped responding to verbal communication entirely, though he remained conscious and seemed to be listening to sounds that nobody else could hear. His eyes, now completely black due to permanent pupil dilation, tracked movement throughout the room with predatory focus. When medical staff approached his bed, he would tense up like an animal preparing to strike, and they noticed that his fingernails had grown longer and harder, almost resembling claws. Most unsettling was his apparent fixation on the medical team's exposed skin, particularly areas where major blood vessels were visible, such as the neck and wrists. Dr. Martinez's final report, filed at 10:47 p.m. on October 3rd, recommended immediate transfer to a specialized infectious disease facility with maximum security protocols. She noted that Jacob's condition appeared to be stabilizing, but not in any way that suggested recovery or improvement. Instead, he seemed to be transitioning into something else entirely, something that retained human intelligence and awareness, but had fundamentally different biological needs and behaviors. Her recommendation was that Jacob be treated as a potential biological weapon rather than a patient, and that all personnel who had come into contact with him should be quarantined and monitored for signs of infection. That report was never filed with the appropriate authorities, because Jacob Nemeth died at 11:23 p.m. on October 3rd, just 36 minutes after Dr. Martinez completed her final assessment. The cause of death was listed as acute systemic failure brought on by parasitic infection, though the medical team noted that his final moments were unlike anything they had witnessed in their combined decades of medical practice. Jacob's body simply stopped functioning, as if someone had turned off a switch, but his eyes remained open and aware until the very end, staring at something beyond the ceiling that only he could see. The facility's standard protocol for handling potentially infectious deceased patients required immediate transfer to a specialized morgue with enhanced containment measures. Jacob's body was placed in a sealed refrigeration unit designed to prevent any possible contamination, and arrangements were made for transport to a pathology facility in Bucharest, where experts in infectious diseases could conduct a complete post-mortem examination. The medical team believed they had successfully contained whatever had killed Jacob, and there was even discussion about the potential for developing new treatments based on their observations of the parasitic organisms. They had no way of knowing that Jacob's death was not an ending, but a metamorphosis. At 11:47 p.m., 24 minutes after he had been officially pronounced dead, the motion sensors in the facility morgue detected movement in the sealed containment area. Security footage shows the morgue door opening from the inside, though no personnel were authorized to be in that section during the night shift. When the morning staff arrived, they found Jacob's refrigeration unit standing open, the body missing, and evidence of what appeared to be a violent struggle in the surrounding corridors. The scratches in the metal walls were deep enough to suggest inhuman strength, and the blood trails led not toward the exits, but deeper into the facility's laboratory complex. Most disturbing were the security camera recordings from the hours following Jacob's disappearance, showing glimpses of a pale figure moving through the corridors with speed and agility that defied human limitations. The thing that had once been Jacob Nemeth was hunting through Facility 7, and it was no longer alone. By dawn on October 4th, 3 more staff members had vanished, and the facility's emergency protocols had been activated for the first and final time. This is Henry Scott, still broadcasting from my concrete shelter in the mountains, and I'm going to tell you something that will chill you to the bone. The classified medical reports I've obtained contain detailed descriptions of the parasitic organisms found in Jacob's blood, including electron microscope images that show these creatures in horrifying detail. They're not just parasites, they're biological machines designed to transform human beings into something else entirely. Something that can survive death, something that hungers for blood, and something that retains enough human intelligence to hunt with terrifying efficiency. Jacob Nimeth wasn't the first victim of this ancient plague. He was the first soldier in an army that had been waiting 8 centuries to wake up and reclaim the world. This is Henry Scott, broadcasting from Emergency Station Alpha 7 in the Carpathian Mountains. The date is October 23rd, 2024, and I'm beginning my 14th day in this underground bunker that's become both my sanctuary and my prison. The generator's fuel gauge is showing less than 1/4 remaining, and I've calculated that I have maybe 4 more days of power before everything goes dark. The irony isn't lost on me that I might end up trapped in the same kind of silence that consumed Facility 7, but I need to keep transmitting as long as possible. Someone needs to hear this story. Someone needs to understand what really happened during those final 18 hours when everything fell apart. I've been going through my mother's personal research files, documents she somehow managed to upload to a secure server just hours before the facility went silent. These aren't the sanitized reports that would have gone to government oversight committees, but her raw observations, her growing terror, and her desperate attempts to understand what she had helped unleash. Reading her words feels like listening to a voice from beyond the grave, because I'm no longer certain that anyone who was inside Facility 7 during those final hours survived in any form that could still be called human. The transformation of Jacob Nemeth from corpse to predator was just the beginning of a cascade of horror that consumed the entire facility in less than 24 hours. My mother's timestamp logs show that the first additional disappearance occurred at 12:53 a.m. on October 4th, approximately 1 hour and 6 minutes after Jacob's body vanished from the morgue. Dr. Angela Thornfield, a biochemist working the night shift in Laboratory C, failed to respond to routine check-in protocols. Security footage from the corridor outside her lab shows a brief struggle, lasting no more than 15 seconds before the camera feed cuts to static. When the morning security team investigated Dr. Thornfield's laboratory, they found signs of what appeared to be a violent attack. Her chair was overturned, laboratory equipment was scattered across the floor, and there were dark stains on the workbench that later tested positive for human blood. Most disturbing was the condition of her research materials, specifically the blood samples she had been analyzing from Jacob's initial infection. The refrigerated storage units had been torn open from the inside, and every sample vial had been drained completely dry, as if something had consumed their contents with desperate hunger. Dr. Thornfield's body was discovered at 6:15 a.m. in a maintenance tunnel beneath the facility, but the medical examination revealed changes that defied explanation. Like Jacob, she appeared to have died from systemic failure, but her body showed none of the decomposition that should have occurred during the 6 hours since her disappearance. Her skin had taken on the same grayish pallor, her fingernails had grown longer and harder, and her eyes remained open with pupils dilated to complete blackness. Most unsettling was the apparent smile frozen on her face, an expression of satisfaction or hunger that suggested she had died while experiencing something pleasurable. Facility's Chief of Security, Colonel James Morrison, immediately implemented Code Red protocols, sealing all exits and placing the entire complex under quarantine. His emergency report to military headquarters requested immediate evacuation and sterilization procedures, but the response from his superiors was to maintain containment and continue observation. The government wanted to understand what they were dealing with before they decided whether to eliminate it or weaponize it. That decision, driven by scientific curiosity and military ambition, doomed everyone inside those concrete walls. By noon on October 4th, 2 more staff members had vanished under similar circumstances. Dr. Benjamin Carlson from the pathology department and Lieutenant Sandra Phillips from the security team both disappeared during routine activities, leaving behind evidence of brief struggles and completely drained blood storage containers. The pattern was becoming clear to my mother and the other surviving researchers, though the facility administration refused to acknowledge what they were witnessing. The dead were not staying dead, and they were systematically hunting down the living with an intelligence and coordination that suggested they retained human memories and reasoning abilities. My mother's notes from that afternoon describe her growing realization that the parasitic organisms were not just transforming individual hosts, but were somehow connected to each other through means that conventional science couldn't explain. Security footage showed the infected moving through the facility with purpose, as if they were following some kind of shared plan, or responding to signals that only they could perceive. When one of them encountered a potential victim, others would appear within minutes, suggesting a level of communication and cooperation that made them far more dangerous than isolated predators. The most chilling discovery came when Dr. Martinez attempted to perform an autopsy on Dr. Thornfield's body at 2:30 p.m. The moment she made the first incision, Dr. Thornfield's eyes snapped open and her hand grabbed Dr. Martinez's wrist with crushing force. The supposedly dead woman sat up on the examination table and spoke in a voice that was recognizably her own, but carried an undertone of something alien and predatory. She said, "Rebecca, you shouldn't have done that. Now we have to add you to the family." The security recording of that encounter shows Dr. Martinez screaming for help while Dr. Thornfield's teeth, which had somehow become sharp and pointed, found her throat. The infection spread through the facility's population with horrifying efficiency because the transformed victims retained enough of their human appearance and behavior to move freely among the staff before revealing their true nature. Dr. Thornfield, now something far more dangerous than the woman who had worked in Laboratory C for 5 years, used her security clearance and knowledge of facility procedures to access restricted areas and approach colleagues who had no reason to suspect her intentions. The trust and familiarity that bound the research team together became weapons in the hands of creatures that understood human psychology better than any normal predator ever could. By 6 p.m. on October 4th, more than half of the facility's 68-person staff had either disappeared or been found in the same state of apparent death, followed by resurrection. The surviving personnel, including my mother, had barricaded themselves in the most secure areas of the complex, but the infected were systematically breaking through their defenses, using not just inhuman strength, but intimate knowledge of the facility's layout, security systems, and emergency protocols. They cut power to certain sections, disabled communication equipment, and sabotaged the ventilation systems with the precision of trained saboteurs. Colonel Morrison's final security report, transmitted at 7:42 p.m., described a complete breakdown of containment and requested immediate military intervention. He reported that the infected displayed coordinated tactical behavior and seemed to be led by Jakob Nemeth, who had somehow retained his technical knowledge and was using it to help the others access secured areas. Most disturbing was Morrison's observation that the creatures were not randomly attacking staff members, but appeared to be selecting specific individuals based on their expertise and security clearances, as if they were building a more capable version of the research team. The last coordinated attempt at escape occurred at 9:15 p.m., when the 12 remaining uninfected staff members tried to reach the facility's emergency exit using a route that should have been secure. My mother's personal account of that attempt describes moving through darkened corridors while being stalked by colleagues and friends who had been transformed into something that retained their human faces, but moved with predatory grace. The infected didn't attack immediately, but followed the group at a distance, herding them away from potential exits and toward areas where escape would be impossible. Dr. Elena Scott, my mother, was separated from the group when a section of the facility's lighting system failed, plunging them into complete darkness. In her written account, she describes hearing familiar voices calling her name from the shadows, colleagues asking for help or claiming to have found a way out. But she could tell from the way they moved, from the sound of their breathing, that these were no longer the people she had worked with for years. She found refuge in a maintenance closet and remained hidden for hours while things that had once been human searched for her with patient determination. The facility's central computer system shows the last human access logged at 11:27 p.m. on October 4th, when my mother used her security credentials to upload her research files to an external server. Her final notes describe a facility completely overrun by the infected, with every hiding place compromised and every escape route blocked. She writes about hearing them in the ventilation system, their voices echoing through the ducts as they coordinated their search. Most terrifying was her realization that they weren't trying to kill the remaining survivors, but were actively working to corner and capture them for some purpose she couldn't understand. The timestamps on the facility's internal monitoring systems show systematic destruction of equipment and records beginning at midnight on October 5th. The infected were not just eliminating evidence of what had happened, but were methodically destroying anything that might help outsiders understand or counter their condition. They disabled the emergency communication arrays, corrupted computer databases, and even destroyed physical documents with a thoroughness that suggested they understood the importance of preventing their secrets from reaching the outside world. My mother's final transmission came at 3:47 a.m. on October 5th, broadcast on an emergency frequency that she had somehow managed to access despite the facility's communication blackout. Her voice was barely recognizable, distorted by exhaustion and terror, but her words were clear enough to understand. She said, "Henry, if you're listening to this, they're not dead. They're changing. The Bartholomew Protocol, it's real. Find the monastery records, find Brother Bartholomew's research. The answer is in the salt, in the iron, in the old ways. They're coming for me now, but I've hidden something for you. Station 7, frequency 9.2. Remember the place where we used to watch the stars?" The transmission ended with sounds that still haunt my sleep, voices I recognized calling my mother's name in tones that mixed affection with hunger. Then came her scream, cut short by static, followed by silence that has lasted for 19 days. The military sealed Facility 7 with concrete and steel within hours of that final broadcast, but not before automated sensors detected movement throughout the complex. Whatever happened to my mother and the other staff members, whatever they became during those final hours, they're still down there beneath tons of concrete, waiting in the darkness. But here's what terrifies me most about my mother's final message. What keeps me awake despite my exhaustion and fear. She mentioned the Bartholomew Protocol as if it were something real, something documented, not just a random reference to medieval superstition. I've been searching through every database I can access from this bunker, looking for any mention of Brother Bartholomew or protocols related to parasitic infections. And what I've found suggests that this nightmare began long before that archaeological team opened the crypt in Baltani. Someone, somewhere, has been preparing for this outbreak for centuries. This is Henry Scott, broadcasting from the darkness of the Carpathian Mountains, and I need you to understand that Facility 7 was not the end of this horror, but the beginning. The infected are no longer contained behind concrete walls, and they're spreading through Eastern Europe with the same methodical intelligence they used to destroy the research facility. They remember who they used to be, they retain their human knowledge and skills, and they're building something that will make their escape from that underground tomb look like a minor setback in a much larger plan. This is Henry Scott, broadcasting from Emergency Station Alpha 7, deep in the Carpathian Mountains of Romania. The date is October 27th, 2024, and I'm now 18 days into what I've begun to think of as the last normal conversation anyone will ever have. The generator is running on fumes and prayer at this point, with maybe 2 days of fuel remaining. But I need to tell you about what's been happening across Eastern Europe while I've been hiding in this concrete tomb. The infection didn't stay buried beneath tons of concrete and government lies. It got out, and it's spreading with a methodical intelligence that makes me question whether we're dealing with a plague or an invasion. I've been monitoring emergency frequencies across Romania, Hungary, Slovakia, and the Czech Republic, and the pattern is always the same, terrifyingly predictable in its efficiency. First comes the isolated incident, usually reported as a violent crime or animal attack in a rural area. Then hospital reports of victims suffering from severe anemia and blood loss, despite wounds that shouldn't have been fatal. Within 48 hours, local authorities implement emergency protocols for what they describe as a viral outbreak or contaminated water supply. By the fourth day, martial law is declared and all communication from the affected area ceases entirely. It's as if entire towns are being systematically erased from the map, one by one, in a spreading circle of silence that grows larger each day. The first town to fall after Facility 7 was Brasov, the same city where Jakob Nimeth had lived with his girlfriend Maria. It started on October 8th, just 3 days after the facility went dark, with what local police initially reported as a home invasion gone wrong. A family of 4 was found dead in their apartment, drained of blood but showing minimal external trauma. The victims appeared to have died peacefully in their sleep, if not for the fact that their bodies were completely exsanguinated and their skin had taken on the same grayish pallor I'd seen described in the facility reports. The local coroner, Dr. Florin Aldescu, noted unusual bite marks on the victims' necks and wrists, but attributed them to animal predation after death. What Dr. Aldescu didn't know, and what I've pieced together from intercepted police communications, is that Maria Popescu had been missing from her apartment for 5 days when those first bodies were discovered. Her neighbors reported seeing her returning home on October 6th, 2 days after Jacob's transformation, but described her behavior as strange and withdrawn. She avoided daylight, kept her curtains drawn constantly, and could be heard moving around her apartment at all hours of the night. When concerned friends tried to check on her, she would speak to them through the door, but refused to let anyone inside, claiming she was feeling unwell and didn't want to spread her illness. The connection between Maria and the infected victims became clear when surveillance footage from the apartment building was finally analyzed 3 days after the initial discovery. The recordings showed Maria leaving her apartment each night between 2 and 4 a.m., moving through the corridors with unusual grace and purpose. She would return before dawn, often with dark stains on her clothing that the investigating officers initially assumed were from working a night shift job. But when they traced her movements through the building's security system, they discovered that she had been systematically visiting other apartments, using her knowledge of the building's layout and her relationships with neighbors to gain access to their homes. Dr. Aldescu's revised autopsy reports, filed just hours before Brasov went under quarantine, revealed that the bite marks on the victims were distinctly human, but showed characteristics that defied medical explanation. The teeth marks were deeper and more precisely placed than any normal human bite, targeting major arteries with surgical accuracy. Most disturbing was evidence that the victims had been fed upon multiple times over several days, suggesting that their attacker had been keeping them alive to harvest their blood gradually, rather than killing them outright. This methodical approach to predation indicated a level of planning and restraint that transformed the attacks from crimes of passion into something resembling livestock management. By October 10th, Brasov's hospital was reporting 17 cases of severe anemia among bite victims who had survived their initial encounters. Dr. Anka Radu, the head of emergency medicine, noted that these patients shared common symptoms including extreme photosensitivity, elevated body temperature fluctuations, and an unusual craving for rare meat and blood-based foods. More concerning was their behavioral changes, particularly increased aggression and a tendency to group together in the hospital's darkest rooms. Dr. Radu's final report, transmitted just before the city's communication blackout, described patients who appeared to be coordinating their actions and demonstrating knowledge they shouldn't have possessed about hospital procedures and security protocols. The last official transmission from Brasov came from Mayor Constantin Dumitrescu at 11:43 p.m. on October 11th. His emergency broadcast to regional authorities described the complete breakdown of municipal services and requested immediate military intervention. He reported that approximately 30% of the city's population had either disappeared or was exhibiting symptoms consistent with the mysterious blood disorder. Most alarming was his observation that the affected individuals seemed to be organizing themselves into groups and taking control of key infrastructure, including the power grid, water treatment facility, and communication networks. Mayor Dumitrescu's final words were, "They're not acting like sick people. They're acting like an occupying force." The military response to Brasov followed the same pattern that had been used to contain Facility 7. Rather than sending medical teams or evacuation units, the Romanian armed forces established a perimeter 20 miles outside the city and declared the entire area a biological hazard zone. Any civilians attempting to leave Brasov were detained for quarantine observation. But according to leaked military reports, most of these refugees showed signs of infection within 72 hours of their capture. The few who remained uninfected provided consistent accounts of a city where the normal social order had collapsed and been replaced by something that resembled a hive mind more than human society. From Brasov, the infection spread along major transportation routes with devastating efficiency. The next cities to fall were Ploiesti, Pitești, and Târgoviște, each following the same 4-day progression from isolated incidents to complete communication blackout. What made this spread particularly terrifying was the evidence that the infected were using their retained human knowledge to facilitate the plague's expansion. Infected truck drivers transported contaminated materials along highway corridors. Infected railway workers modified train schedules to carry victims to new population centers, and infected government officials used their administrative access to delay emergency responses and cover up early warning signs. By October 15th, the infection had crossed international borders into Hungary and Slovakia. The first confirmed case in Budapest was Dr. Pavel Kovac, an epidemiologist who had been consulting with Romanian authorities about the Brasov outbreak. Dr. Kovac had returned from a fact-finding mission to the quarantine zone on October 13th, reporting no direct contact with infected individuals and showing no symptoms of illness. 3 days later, his colleagues at the National Institute of Public Health found him in his laboratory, apparently dead from the same systemic failure that had claimed Jakob Nemeth and the other facility victims. Unlike the Romanian cases, however, Dr. Kovac's transformation was documented by security cameras throughout the institute. The footage of Dr. Kovac's resurrection, which I obtained through channels I still can't fully explain, shows the moment of transition from death to something else entirely. At exactly 24 minutes after his recorded time of death, his body simply sat up on the examination table as if waking from sleep. His movements were fluid and purposeful, showing none of the disorientation or confusion that might be expected from someone returning from clinical death. Most unsettling was his immediate behavior, which involved systematically destroying his research notes and contaminating blood samples throughout the laboratory with what appeared to be his own infected blood. Dr. Kovac's actions during his first hours as an infected individual revealed the true scope of the threat facing Eastern Europe. Rather than attacking random victims or feeding indiscriminately, he used his security clearance and professional relationships to access the Institute's database of regional blood banks, organ donation facilities, and hospital networks. Within 6 hours of his transformation, contaminated blood products were being distributed throughout Budapest's medical system, ensuring that the infection would spread through the most vulnerable populations first. The infected weren't just hunting for food, they were systematically dismantling the infrastructure that could be used to fight them. The pattern repeated itself in Prague, Bratislava, and Vienna, with infected individuals using their professional expertise to maximize the spread of the plague while minimizing early detection. Infected doctors modified blood screening protocols to hide the presence of the parasitic organisms. Infected government officials delayed quarantine procedures and emergency declarations, and infected media personnel suppressed news reports that might have warned potential victims. The coordination between infected individuals across multiple countries suggested a level of communication that transcended normal human limitations, as if they were all part of a single distributed intelligence working toward a common goal. But perhaps the most chilling discovery came from intercepted communications between various European intelligence agencies, documents that somehow found their way to my secure communication channels. These reports describe infected individuals who retain detailed memories of their human lives, including classified information, state secrets, and personal relationships that they were using to infiltrate and corrupt government responses to the outbreak. An infected parliamentary member in Slovakia was found to have been voting on emergency legislation while secretly coordinating with infected counterparts in neighboring countries to ensure that containment efforts would fail at critical moments. The infected weren't just spreading randomly through the population. They were deliberately targeting individuals whose knowledge and positions would be most useful for expanding their influence. Scientists, government officials, military personnel, and medical professionals were being systematically converted, creating a shadow network of infected individuals who retained their human expertise while serving the agenda of whatever intelligence was controlling the outbreak. Each newly infected person brought their skills, their access codes, their relationships, and their secrets into the collective, making the entire plague more dangerous and more capable with each passing day. I received a transmission 3 nights ago that has haunted every moment since. It came on my mother's old emergency frequency, the same one she had mentioned in her final broadcast from Facility 7. The voice was familiar but wrong, distorted in ways that had nothing to do with radio interference or distance. It was Dr. Pavel Kovac, or what had once been Dr. Pavel Kovac, speaking in perfect English, despite the fact that his personnel files indicated he spoke only Hungarian and Romanian. He said, "Henry Scott, we know you're listening. We know what your mother told you about the Bartholomew Protocol and the monastery records. We've been waiting for someone like you, someone with the bloodline, someone who can help us complete what was started 8 centuries ago." The transmission continued for nearly 10 minutes, with the thing that had been Dr. Kovac describing details about my childhood, my relationship with my mother, and my current location that should have been impossible for him to know. He spoke about the infection not as a plague or a curse, but as an evolution, a return to something that humanity had lost when it abandoned the old ways and embraced the weakness of modern civilization. Most terrifying was his offer, delivered in tones that mixed seduction with threat, inviting me to join them willingly, rather than wait to be hunted down and converted by force. This is Henry Scott, and this may be my final transmission from Emergency Station Alpha 7. The date is October 31st, 2024, and I'm broadcasting on backup power after the main generator finally died 6 hours ago. I have perhaps 12 hours of battery life remaining before this bunker becomes as silent as the rest of Eastern Europe. I need to tell you about the Bartholomew manuscripts, about the parasitic organism that's been dormant for 8 centuries, and about the biological horror that's transforming our loved ones into something that hungers for human blood. I left the bunker 3 days ago, abandoning the only safety I'd known for weeks, because staying meant slow death by starvation and isolation. The coordinates led me through mountain passes that no modern map showed, along paths that seemed carved by medieval pilgrims rather than contemporary travelers. The journey took me deeper into the Carpathian wilderness than I'd ever imagined possible, to ruins so ancient and forgotten that even the local shepherds spoke of them only in whispers and crossed themselves when they accidentally mentioned their location. The hidden monastery was built into the living rock of the mountain itself, its stones so weathered by centuries of wind and rain that they seem to have grown from the earth rather than been placed by human hands. Unlike the tourist-friendly medieval sites scattered throughout Romania, this place radiated an aura of deliberate concealment, as if its builders had intended for it to remain lost to the world until someone desperate enough would eventually find it. The architecture was purely medieval Christian, but the craftsmanship suggested builders who understood the importance of creating structures that could last through multiple catastrophes. The entrance was sealed behind iron gates that bore symbols I recognized from my mother's research notes, the same markings that had been carved into the crypt where the original infected corpse had been discovered. But these gates weren't locked, and when I pushed them open, they moved silently on hinges that had been recently maintained despite the monastery's apparent abandonment. The air that flowed from the monastery's interior carried scents of salt and metal and preservatives, as if someone had been using this place as a storage facility for materials that needed to remain stable across centuries. The chambers beneath the monastery altar were accessible through a spiral staircase carved directly into the stone, descending so far into the mountain that I lost count of the steps after reaching 300. The walls were lined with niches containing what appeared to be medical supplies and preservation materials, items that belonged to a sophisticated understanding of biochemistry disguised as religious ritual. There were iron implements designed for precise surgical procedures, silver containers holding various chemical compounds, and vials containing crystalline salts that had been treated with herbs and minerals to create natural antibiotics and preservatives. The Bartholomew manuscripts were waiting for me in a chamber sealed behind iron and silver, exactly as Dr. Kovac had promised, arranged on a stone table as if they had been prepared for my arrival. The documents were written on parchment that had been treated with chemical preservatives to prevent decay, maintained in conditions that would keep them readable for centuries. Brother Bartholomew's handwriting was clear and precise, the work of a scholar who understood both medicine and biology far ahead of his time, someone who had spent years studying a parasitic organism that defied medieval understanding of disease and infection. Brother Bartholomew wasn't just a monk, according to his own writings. He was a physician and natural philosopher who had been studying what he called the bloodworm plague for over 30 years before the great outbreak of 1547. His manuscripts described the parasitic organism in terms that would be recognizable to any modern parasitologist, detailing its life cycle, its method of transmission, and its effects on human physiology with scientific precision that was centuries ahead of his time. The monastery had served as a research facility where he and other scholar physicians studied infected individuals and developed methods for containing and potentially curing the parasitic infection. The parasites, according to Bartholomew's research, were not supernatural entities but biological organisms that had evolved to form symbiotic relationships with human hosts. These creatures could remain dormant for centuries in the right conditions, but when introduced into a living human bloodstream, they would multiply rapidly and begin altering the host's metabolism, nervous system, and blood chemistry. The infected individuals retained their human memories and intelligence, but their biological needs changed dramatically, requiring regular consumption of fresh human blood to maintain the parasitic colony living within their circulatory system. The original vampire, the creature found in the Balteni monastery crypt, had been identified by Bartholomew as Valerian Dragos, a nobleman and amateur physician who had become infected during an outbreak in the 11th century. Dragos had survived his infection longer than most hosts, allowing the parasites within his body to reach full maturity and reproductive capacity. Rather than dying from the metabolic changes, he had learned to manage his condition through careful feeding and had begun deliberately infecting others to create a sustainable population of hosts that could support his own parasitic colony's need for genetic diversity. The restraint methods used on Dragos were not torture, as the archaeological team had assumed, but a medical containment system designed to keep him alive while preventing him from feeding or infecting others. The iron rods had been driven through specific nerve centers to paralyze the body while leaving the brain and essential organs functional, and the salt lining had been treated with herbs and minerals that suppressed the parasite's reproductive cycle. The religious scriptures wrapped around the body contained detailed medical notes disguised as prayers, documenting the precise chemical formulas needed to maintain the preservation process indefinitely. Brother Bartholomew's final entries, written during the Black Death outbreak of 1347, revealed that the plague ravaging Europe was not a natural disease, but the result of Dragos's infected followers attempting to free their master from his salt-lined prison. These infected individuals had retained enough human intelligence and social skills to infiltrate monasteries and government institutions, using their positions to locate and eliminate the physician monks who understood how to treat the parasitic infection. By the time Bartholomew realized what was happening, most of his colleagues were dead, and the infection was spreading too rapidly to contain using medieval medical techniques. The The most disturbing discovery in the manuscripts was Bartholomew's documentation of how the parasites affected human behavior and decision-making. The infected didn't become mindless monsters, but their priorities and moral framework became entirely focused on ensuring the survival and spread of their parasitic passengers. They retained human empathy and emotional connections, but only toward other infected individuals, viewing uninfected humans as either potential hosts or sources of nourishment. This created infected individuals who could maintain relationships and social roles, while systematically working to expand the parasitic population. But Bartholomew had also discovered something that offered hope for treatment and prevention. The parasites showed sensitivity to specific chemical compounds found in certain plants and minerals, substances that could be used to create both protective treatments for uninfected individuals and potentially curative remedies for newly infected hosts. More importantly, he had documented cases of individuals who showed natural resistance to infection, people whose blood chemistry was incompatible with the parasite's reproductive cycle. These individuals seemed to carry genetic traits that could be passed down through bloodlines, creating families with inherited protection against the parasitic infection. As I read these words, I understood why my mother had been so interested in my medical history and why she had always insisted on treating even minor injuries herself rather than taking me to doctors. The scar on my left palm, which I had carried since childhood, was not from an accident, but from a test she had performed to determine if I carried the genetic resistance that Bartholomew had documented. My blood chemistry was apparently incompatible with the parasites, making me immune to infection, but also making my blood potentially toxic to infected individuals who consumed it. The final manuscript contained detailed instructions for what Bartholomew called the Great Purification, a chemical treatment that could be introduced into water supplies or food sources to eliminate parasitic infections across large populations. The procedure required specific materials that had been hidden in various monastery locations throughout Europe, along with someone who understood both the chemical processes involved and the biological life cycle of the parasites. Bartholomew had prepared these materials and documented the process, but had died before he could implement the treatment during the medieval outbreak. That's when I heard them coming down the stone stairs, their footsteps echoing through chambers that had been silent for centuries. Multiple sets of feet, moving with careful coordination but maintaining the rhythm and gait of normal human beings. I gathered the manuscripts and retreated deeper into the chamber, but there was nowhere to go. No escape route that would allow me to outrun people who knew this mountain better than I did and had probably been watching my approach for hours. The first figure to enter the chamber was exactly who I expected to see, though part of me had hoped against hope that it wouldn't be her. My mother, Dr. Elena Scott, stood in the doorway looking exactly as she had during our last conversation 2 years ago, except for the pale skin and dilated pupils that marked her as infected. Behind her came others I recognized from the facility photographs: Dr. Angela Thornfield, Dr. Benjamin Carlson, Jacob Nimeth, and several other staff members who had supposedly died during the outbreak, but had instead been transformed into hosts for ancient parasites that demanded human blood for survival. My mother spoke first, and her voice was exactly as I remembered it from childhood, warm and caring, but tinged with an urgency that I now understood came from biological needs that transcended human emotion. She said, "Henry, I'm so sorry you had to learn the truth this way. I tried to protect you, tried to keep you away from all of this, but you're the only one who can help us now. You have Brother Bartholomew's research, and you have the genetic resistance that makes your blood incompatible with our condition. We need you to help us find a way to manage this infection without destroying what we've become." The infected had not come to kill me or forcibly convert me, but to ask for my help in solving a biological problem that was killing them as surely as it was transforming them. They explained that the parasitic infection was not sustainable in its current form, that infected individuals were slowly dying as the parasites consumed their host's resources faster than human metabolism could replenish them. Without finding a way to stabilize the symbiotic relationship, every infected person would be dead within months, but not before infecting enough new hosts to ensure the parasite's survival through the next cycle of dormancy and reactivation. But as my mother extended her hand toward me, I saw the truth behind her words reflected in the desperate hunger in her eyes and the eyes of the infected gathered around her. They were not offering cooperation or scientific collaboration, but asking me to help them create a sustainable system for farming human blood from uninfected populations. They wanted to use Bartholomew's research not to cure the infection, but to perfect it, creating a world where infected individuals could maintain their enhanced physical capabilities while treating uninfected humans as livestock rather than equals. The radio equipment I had brought with me crackled to life, picking up signals from across Eastern Europe, as various emergency broadcast stations reported the same pattern of systematic infrastructure collapse and population disappearance. The infected were not working together through supernatural means, but were simply following the same biological imperatives and using their retained human intelligence to maximize their chances of survival. They were taking control of major population centers, not through coordinated planning, but because cities provided the largest concentrations of potential food sources and new hosts. As I looked at my mother's face, seeing both the woman who had raised me and the biological desperation that now drove her every decision, I realized that my choice would determine not just my own fate, but whether the parasitic infection would become a permanent part of human evolution or would burn itself out through its own biological limitations. I could help them create their sustainable feeding system and doom humanity to a future as cattle, or I could attempt to implement Bartholomew's great purification and destroy everyone I had ever loved, along with the parasites that were consuming them from within. This is Henry Scott, broadcasting from the depths of an ancient monastery where the fate of our species hangs in the balance. The infected are not monsters or supernatural entities. They are our loved ones transformed by parasites that are slowly killing them while demanding they kill others to survive. They retain their human intelligence and emotions, but those feelings are now subordinated to biological needs that make them see uninfected humans as resources rather than people. Brother Bartholomew's research offers a solution, but implementing it would mean choosing between saving humanity and saving everyone I care about who has already been infected. The signal is failing, the battery power is nearly exhausted, but if anyone is still listening, if anyone still remembers what it means to be human, then know that sometimes the most terrible choices are the ones between two different kinds of love.